In this lecture, we're going to talk a little bit about doing research. This builds off of what your book already says about the research process and persuasion. And as I say of doing research, it's more fun than it sounds. Because what is more fun than finding out why or what will happen? I mean, come on, that's some pretty fun stuff. So let me begin by going over a little bit of the research process. A research project starts by you deciding what intrigues you. And so in the case of persuasion, a person might begin by thinking about how guilt affects persuasion. Maybe they're really interested in how often do people do things out of a sense of guilt. That's a good starting point. We have to make sure that what we're doing is based on a clear theory or concept. And by concept, I mean that guilt isn't really a theory, but there's a concept of guilt, right? And that how guilt affects persuasion or humor or shock, right? How do these things affect persuasion? Those are certain concepts, as opposed to theories like, say, expand parallel process models, a theory that explains to us when fear does and does not affect behavior. So you start with some sort of clear theory or concept. And what I mean by that is something in the literature already, actual research out there about what happens in persuasion. And so, say the theory or concept you're using here, if in this case a person would be using would be the use of guilt appeals. Guilt appeals to get people to comply with a request. Right? You then, or a researcher then, has to decide what are the variables in the study. What things am I going to be messing with, and then what outcomes am I going to be looking for? Right? The variables are really the things you mess with. You make high, you make low, right? You make present or not present, and then the things you're looking to see how they're affected by that. So in this case, you're looking at the presence of guilt, and then say a person's compliance with a behavior. Right? If you feel really guilty about something, will you then donate money? Will you give your time? Will you sign a petition? Right? Some sort of compliance. And then a researcher has to decide, are you asking or guessing? What do I mean by that? Well, let's turn the page and find out. So when I say, are you asking, or are you guessing, that's about H's and RQs. And when I say H's and RQs, an H is a hypothesis. And a hypothesis makes a prediction. So there will be a statement where you predict what you think is a relationship between two variables. That if something is present, this will happen. Or if this is high, this will happen. You're making a prediction. So therefore, it's a statement. It's not a question, it's a statement. So in this case, people will be more likely to comply with a guilt rather than a factual appeal. Using guilt rather than a factual appeal will increase compliance. As a researcher, when it's all said and done, you're going to basically say yes or no. I mean, actual research is a bit more complex than this. There's some different terminology used, but that's the main idea, right? You make a prediction, this will happen, and then the answer is yes or no. Now, sometimes when people hear a hypothesis and making a prediction, they want to do something like 80% of people comply with the use of a guilt appeal. Okay, that is not an appropriate hypothesis, right? A hypothesis is a statement of what is more or less likely, right? Or what will or will not happen, and then it's a yes or no. But we don't do things like, here's the target. We don't really make hypotheses like that. And a person uses hypotheses or a hypothesis when the research suggests what will happen. So you look at the literature, and from reading it, you say, well, based on all of that, I bet when you use a guilt appeal talking about, support for a local animal shelter, given what we know about people's soft spot for animals and the effectiveness of guilt appeals, I'm guessing that this, in fact, will increase people's willingness to donate to an animal shelter, or using guilt appeal rather than using a factual appeal. Right? So you use a hypothesis when the research tells us, when you can guess from the research what you'll probably find. Or you sort of have a good sense of what is going to be there. You have a hypothesis. By contrast, sometimes we need an RQ, which is a research question. And a research question does just that. It asks a question. So as opposed to saying what guilt will do, the question is things like, how does guilt affect compliance? That's a research question. How does guilt affect compliance? And the answer might be, it increases compliance, it decreases compliance, it has no effect on compliance. Those might be you'll probably have one of those three, right, one of those three findings. So when would you use a research question versus a hypothesis? You use a research question when the research doesn't help you to form a prediction. If there hasn't really been much done on guilt appeals, or not much done on guilt appeals about, say, things like animals, then you may not know what's going to happen, and so you use a research question. And so sometimes, based on the research, we have a pretty good sense of what we're going to get, and sometimes we just don't know. There's nothing wrong with a research question. A research question is just as valid to use as a hypothesis, but it's just a matter of really whether or not we think we know what we're going to find, or if we're just like, no clue, will it happen or not? And it really has to do with what the research says you will or won't find. So in talking about research, I'm really talking here about doing experiments. And when we're doing experiments, typically we do either some sort of pre-test, post-test thing, or we go about comparing means. And so in the next few slides, I'm going to talk about the difference between doing a pre-test, post-test experiment versus comparing means. So my friends, it is my honor to introduce to you Solomon's four-group design. So what we're going to look at here is the sort of classic model of performing experiments with people. And there's three columns there: a pre-test, experiment, and post-test. I'll talk about that in a second. I want to start by looking at the groups. When it says group 1, 2, 3, 4, those are 4 different groups of subjects in a given study. So you might have 40 people in group 1, in which case you'd want to have about 40 people in group 2, and in group 3, and in group 4. So when we say groups, these are people, those are the groups of subjects. And so each group only experiences certain things different from what other groups experience, and that's how the measurement in the experiment is conducted. So in group 1, let's say we're going to perform our guilt design here. We want to see how guilt appeals affect people's willingness to comply with a request to donate for, say, an animal shelter. So the pre-test, we would ask them what they think about supporting animal shelters. Then in the experiment, we would expose them to a message that has sad-looking puppy dogs and forlorn little cats, and talk about how without an animal shelter, these animals, sweet animals, are not long for the world. And then we do a post-test. We'd look at their likelihood or their willingness to donate to support an animal shelter, right? In group 2, we would just ask those questions about their willingness or likelihood to donate to an animal shelter in a pre-test and a post-test, and in between there, as opposed to exposing them to, say, an ad with the sad puppy dogs and the forlorn-looking kittens. Instead, we have them watch 10 minutes of an infomercial, just something that's not actually a thing we're doing. The third group, those people, as opposed to being asked first whether or not they support the animal shelter, we would just show them, the sad puppy dogs, forlorn kittens, and then ask them their likelihood of supporting an animal shelter. And the fourth group, we just ask them once if they're going to support an animal shelter. Right? So you see that the most important part of the pattern there has to do with the fact that some people are being shown the ad, the persuasive message with the puppies and the kitties, and some are not. And what it comes down to is people who are in the experiment group and those who are in the control group. Right? The experiment groups are those who actually saw the ad with the guilt appeal, and the control group are the ones who didn't. And if you're wondering, like, why would you ever do something like in group 2 where you show somebody the pre-test and then the post-test and you don't have them do anything in between that's relevant? Because what you want to know is whether or not asking questions itself has an effect. Right? So if we looked at group 1, if the scores go up, would you support an animal shelter, from before they watch the ad to after they watch the ad, do the scores go up because they watched that ad with the puppies and the kittens? Or do the scores go up because after they answer the questions the first time, as they do in group 2, and then they have time to think about it without seeing an ad, would those scores have gone up anyway because they thought, why am I so hard on this? I'm such a heel. Yes, of course we should support an animal shelter, right? And it was just them thinking about it and not actually the ad that did it. Or maybe after they answer the pre-test, they think about it some more and they think, The more and more I think about those puppies and kittens are lazy. What do I want a shelter for them? So maybe the scores go down, we'll say. But anyway, the point is there could possibly be a change between pre-test and post-test. It just comes from having gotten a person to answer the questions twice. They may have thought about it and decided to answer a little bit differently. Or maybe not. But what's happening in group 2 versus group 1 is it's trying to control for, as we say, it's trying to consider whether or not asking the questions itself is what creates a change, right? And so then group 3 and group 4, again, we're saying, really what we're doing is just saying, what happens when you watch the ad? Are you, supportive of supporting the shelter versus just are you supportive of supporting a shelter, right? So then we have experiment versus control group. So any experiment has to have at least one experiment and one control group. Typically a group 1 and 2 or group 3 and 4, but sometimes they're really fancy, they do all 4 groups. But that's actually a pretty fancy thing to do. But you see then the general idea of how these things work. So when we have that pre-test, post-test design, right, you might have group A in there in the experiment group, right? And so person 1, their pre-test for whatever, like I say, it could be supporting the animal shelter, is a 19. They think it's a pretty good idea. And 19 is, I don't know, it's just 19. It's in support. And their post-test is a 25. We'd say, oh, look, their score went up by 6 points. And we look at person 2. And they started at a 9, they ended at 15. We say, oh, look, they're up by 5. And we keep doing this. We'd average them together. And if they all look like these two people, the average would be 5.5. And we would say then that the guilt appeal had an average increase in support for the shelter of a 5.5, which would answer a research question of saying, yes, it increases. And the hypothesis would answer by saying, yes, also, right? We'd say, the hypothesis that a guilt appeal will affect compliance would say, yes, it does, right? And a research question would say, yes, it increases, because the direction, whether increase or decrease, wasn't specified. Anyway, so yes, you do person 1, person 2, and you'd sort of look at all the other 38 people in the group, and you'd average it together, and you'd figure out what the average change was. Well, we then compare that with all the people in group B, which say they might then be the control group. And so one person went from a 14 to a 15, so they actually went up by 1. Sort of thought about it a little bit, or some inconsistency. They went by 1. Somebody else, their pre-test to post-test, the change is a 0. And so we'd say, yeah, it looks like really it's the experiment, the message is causing a change, not just that they answered the question twice. And I show you these numbers to illustrate the point. It's not about necessarily what's their final score, right? Because then if we look at person in group A, look at person 1 and person 2, the final score with one of them was 25, the other one was 15. Golly, it had more effect for one than the other. Well, the point is, what was the change? This goes way back to the beginning of class, and that persuasion is about moving people further along a continuum rather than simply do you support it, yes or no, right? And so we look at person 1 versus person 2 in group A, and we see that both of them had a pretty equal increase, even though person 2 ends, right, their post-test is still lower than person 1's pre-test. And the point is just that what we want to look for is how much change was there. But looking at the final score itself is not usually as informative as looking at the amount of change. Right? And we compare the change we saw in group A and say they all look like person 1 and person 2 would be an average of 5.5. And we'd compare that with the average we saw in a control B, in control B, and those two pre-tests there looks like it'd be an average of about a 0.5 increase. So we'd say, yeah, the experiment group, watching the ad, that guilt appeal did seem to increase compliance. Another way of doing research is by comparing means, right? And say, so sometimes we're comparing pre-test and post-test what the change was, but sometimes we don't do a pre-test, right? So what we do is we'd say we're going to make a request without using guilt, right? And our compliance rate, will you support this? And we don't use any guilt at all. Will you support the animal shelter? This compliance rate support is 45%. And then maybe in experiment group 1, we make a request that has a modest guilt appeal. We just mention, oh, the puppies and the kittens, it's too bad how many of them don't have very long lives. There's not a shelter for them to go to. And would you please donate? And so the compliance rate is, equals Y, whatever that number is, in this case, 60%. And then we can have experiment group 2, where you'd make a strong guilt appeal. And this is like Sarah McLachlan, ASPCA, sort of strong, sad music, lots of sad looking puppies and kittens, and talk about how they're not long for this world because there's not enough shelters. And then we look at the compliance rate, and we see it was 75. And so what we do is we compare people who weren't exposed to a message, average rate of, I say X, which here might be 45. Experiment group 1, they saw sort of the, it was a little bit of a guilt, but not too heavy, 60%. Experiment group 2, the guilt's pretty heavy, 75%. And that way we could look at and see that as the guilt becomes more intense, not only does guilt make a difference, but as guilt becomes more intense, right? So guilt makes a difference, but as it's more intense, there is a greater compliance rate, right? And that's how you do it if you're just comparing means. The bottom line to this, findings support a hypothesis, or they suggest an answer to a research question. But in research, nothing is really proven. I mean, we sometimes casually say that, but really you're not proving anything. You're showing support that guilt appeals help to increase compliance, or it suggests that guilt appeals increase compliance. But we're not really proving. We're finding support for a relationship between two variables. Right? We talked about variables early on, right? The variable we're messing with and the variable we're watching to see what happens. And we find support for a relationship, or the findings suggest a relationship, but we do not actually prove there's a relationship. Just a small but important note from one researcher to another.